Miss Olson, federal charges, at least 50 patients, medication records falsified, tampered vials recovered from...
Christina Eileen Olson, a labor and delivery nurse trusted with the most vulnerable patients in her hospital. She is about to feel the full weight of 3 federal charges. And the 50 new mothers she stole from are the reason these agents are here. It would all come down to a single fentanyl vial.
Dispensal unit.
You have no idea what that unit runs on. 12 hours understaffed, and I am the one standing here while the hospital that let this happen for months gets to keep its accreditation.
Glass, 10 milliliters, sitting on a bedside cart in a patient's room where it had no business being. The puncture marks on the top stopper would tell investigators one story. The puncture marks on the bottom stopper would tell them everything. By the time the FDA laboratory finished analyzing what was actually inside, a labor and delivery unit in Waterloo, Iowa would be exposed as a place where at least 50 new mothers, women in active labor, women recovering from cesarean surgery, women in the worst pain of their lives, had been injected with saline instead of the medicine ordered for them. The nurse standing over those beds was about to lose her license, her career, and her freedom. I need you to stay with me on this one. The victims here were women in their most defenseless hours, in labor or post-surgical, depending on a single nurse for pain control in the middle of the night. If this case makes you angry, put that in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't yet. The mothers in this story deserve to have it heard, and channels like this only grow when stories like theirs get shared. Christina Eileen Hovey was born in 1980 in Black Hawk County, Iowa, in a stretch of the state where the river towns blur together: Waterloo, Cedar Falls, Evansdale. Her father worked maintenance at one of the manufacturing plants that still defined the local economy. Her mother worked the front desk at a dental office on University Avenue. The family lived in a small 2-bedroom ranch on the east side of Waterloo, the kind with a chain-link fence around the backyard and a metal swing set that had outlasted 3 Iowa winters. By all accounts, Christina was a quiet child. Teachers at her elementary school described her in report cards as cooperative, attentive, and responsive to direction. She was the kind of student who turned her homework in on time and rarely raised her hand in class. She had 2 younger brothers. She was the responsible one, the one who watched them after school when her parents worked late, the one who learned at 9 years old how to heat up a frozen pizza and set the table without being asked. She graduated from Waterloo East High School in 1999. The yearbook listed her under future plans as to help people. She enrolled at Hawkeye Community College that fall and started working part-time as a certified nursing assistant at a long-term care facility on Logan Avenue. The job paid $8 an hour. She bathed elderly patients, changed beds, fed people who could no longer feed themselves, and learned the rhythms of a medical floor before she had ever held a syringe. The CNA work was the first crack. The patients on her wing at the nursing home were on heavy pain regimens: hydrocodone, morphine patches, oxycodone for the ones in late-stage cancer. Christina was not the one administering those medications. She watched the LPNs and RNs do it. She watched the locked carts open and close. She watched the count sheets get signed in pairs. And she watched, more than once, an agitated patient calm down completely within minutes of a single small pill. She told one of her brothers years later that she knew, by the end of her second year as a CNA, that she wanted to be a nurse. She also told him, in a conversation he would not think about again until 2022, that she sometimes wished she could take some of what those patients took, just to know what it felt like, just to see. She finished her associate's degree in nursing in 2004 and passed the NCLEX RN on her first attempt. She was 23 years old. She was licensed by the State of Iowa Board of Nursing on a humid Tuesday afternoon in July, and her first paycheck as an RN at a long-term care facility in Cedar Falls was deposited 2 weeks later, $368 after taxes. She married Daniel Hovey in 2006. He worked at John Deere in the engine assembly division. They bought a small split level on Hammond Avenue in 2008, took on a 30-year mortgage, and had their first child in 2010, a daughter. 2 years later, a son. The Hovey household ran on overtime shifts at the plant and 12-hour nursing shifts at the hospital, and the kind of exhaustion that two working parents in their late 20s learn to ignore and never quite catch up on. Christina's career advanced. She moved from long-term care to a medical surgical floor at a regional hospital, then to a step-down unit. Then, in 2017, she applied for an opening in labor and delivery at a Waterloo hospital, the kind of unit nurses describe as the happiest floor in the building, and the kind of unit that runs on Schedule II narcotics from sunrise to sunrise. She got the job. Her performance evaluations from the first year describe her as competent, warm with patience, and quick to volunteer for difficult assignments. A note from her charge nurse called her a steady hand in a stressful environment. She passed her competency exams for electronic fetal monitoring, epidural management, and post-cesarean recovery on schedule. The first marriage ended in 2019. The divorce was finalized that fall. The court documents cited irreconcilable differences. Daniel kept the John Deere job. Christina kept the house and primary custody of both children. She took her maiden name back temporarily, then remarried in the spring of 2020 to a man named Olson, an electrician from the Cedar Valley area she had met through a co-worker. The wedding was small, backyard, catered by a barbecue place on LaPorte Road. Her two kids stood up with her in matching outfits the daughter had picked out herself. By the time she finished her name change paperwork with the Iowa Board of Nursing, she was Christina Eileen Olson, RN, with 13 years of experience and a unit badge that opened every medication cabinet on the labor and delivery floor. That was the woman who walked into work on the morning of January 4th, 2022. That was the woman the night shift charge nurse handed off 3 new mothers to. And that was the woman who, by the end of that shift, would begin the pattern that would unravel everything. Labor and delivery is a specific kind of hospital floor. To understand what Olson did, you have to understand what she was given access to. A labor and delivery unit in a hospital the size of the Waterloo facility runs 18 to 24 beds. On any given shift, a single L&D nurse is typically assigned 2 to 3 patients, sometimes more if the floor is short, and those patients fall into 3 broad categories. The first is antepartum, late-term pregnancies admitted for monitoring before delivery, often for high-risk conditions like preeclampsia or gestational diabetes. The second is intrapartum, women in active labor, often on epidurals, often hours from delivery. The third is postpartum, women recovering from delivery, including women recovering from cesarean section surgery. All 3 categories live on a controlled substance regimen. The antepartum patients may be on nothing. The intrapartum patients are on epidural infusions, intravenous opioids, or both. The postpartum patients, especially the cesarean patients, are on scheduled doses of hydromorphone, oxycodone, and in some protocols, low-dose intravenous fentanyl for breakthrough pain. A cesarean section is major abdominal surgery. The recovery is brutal. The pain is not theoretical. The system designed to control those drugs is called an automated dispensing cabinet. In most American hospitals, it is a Pyxis machine, or an Omnicell. It looks like a wide metal cabinet with a touchscreen and a fingerprint reader. A nurse logs in with her credentials, selects the patient she is medicating, selects the drug ordered for that patient, and the machine opens a single drawer with a single dose. Every transaction is logged. Every override is logged. Every discrepancy is supposed to trigger a review at the pharmacy level within 24 hours. The system is supposed to be airtight. The system has a known weakness. The weakness is the nurse. When a controlled substance is pulled for a patient and not used in full, when a dose is wasted, the standard term in nursing, the nurse is required to dispose of the unused portion in front of a witness. Another nurse signs the waste. The system logs the witness. This is the safeguard. This is what is supposed to make diversion impossible. But the safeguard depends on the nurse telling the truth. If a nurse pulls a vial of fentanyl, draws the contents into her own syringe, refills the empty vial with saline, and then administers what she claims is fentanyl to her patient, there is no waste to witness. There is no discrepancy to log. The chart says the patient got the medication. The patient lies in bed wondering why the pain isn't going away. The night moves on. The trust framework on a labor and delivery unit is total. A woman in active labor cannot evaluate her own medication. A postpartum mother on the second day of her cesarean recovery is not going to question the syringe being pushed into her IV port at 3 in the morning. She is going to lie there with her newborn in the bassinet beside her and trust the woman in scrubs whose name is on the whiteboard above her bed. That was the system Olsen worked inside. That was the trust she was given. And that was the trust she would systematically, methodically betray for at least 3 months. Investigators would later piece together that the diversion began no later than January 2022, and likely earlier than that. The exact start date is unclear because the documentation Olsen left in the medical record was, by design, indistinguishable from legitimate care. That was the entire architecture of the scheme. It was the simplest fraud possible. Olsen worked 12-hour shifts, primarily nights and the 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. swing shift. She was assigned, on a typical day, 2 to 3 patients. The patients had standing orders for pain medication, usually intravenous hydromorphone or oral oxycodone, to be administered on a schedule or as needed by patient request. The mechanism worked like this. Olsen would log into the Pyxis cabinet using her nursing credentials. She would select a patient. She would select the medication ordered for that patient. She would pull the dose. The system would log the transaction. The chart would show the medication issued and pending administration. She would then walk into a supply closet, a soiled utility room, or an empty staff restroom. Investigators would never determine exactly which, and she would take the medication herself. Oral pills swallowed, liquid doses injected or consumed. She would then return to the patient's bedside, perform the visual motions of an administration in the patient's view, and chart that the medication had been given at a specific time and dose. The patient, lying in a hospital bed in real pain, would receive nothing. The chart said otherwise. The chart said the patient had received hydromorphone at Oro 2:14. The chart said the patient had received oxycodone at Oro 6:30. The chart said the patient was being managed appropriately for post-cesarean pain. The patient was not. The patient was lying in a hospital bed at 3 in the morning with a fresh surgical incision, the slow pull of the uterus contracting back to size, the sharp pain of the abdominal muscles knitting back together, and no medication in her system at all. She would press the call button. A nurse would come in. The nurse would check the chart. The chart would show she had just received pain medication 40 minutes earlier. The nurse would tell her to wait, to give it time, to breathe through it, to rest if she could. That was the oral and oxycodone mechanism. The fentanyl mechanism was worse. Fentanyl in a labor and delivery unit is typically stocked in small glass vials with a rubber stopper at the top, sealed with an aluminum crimp. The nurse pulls the vial, draws the contents into a syringe with a needle, and administers it to the patient through the IV line. Olsen developed a second technique for fentanyl. She would pull a vial. She would draw the fentanyl out into her own syringe. She would then, using either the same needle or a fresh one, inject saline, sterile salt water, freely available on any hospital floor, back into the vial through the rubber stopper. She would return the now adulterated vial to the unit's medication area, where it would sit, waiting for the next nurse to pull it for the next patient on the floor. The puncture marks she left on the rubber stopper would be how she was finally caught. 2 punctures on the top, 1 puncture on the bottom. A vial used normally is punctured once. Olsen's were punctured twice or 3 times, visible under the right light, damning under a laboratory analysis. The escalation followed a pattern investigators have seen in nurse diversion cases for decades. It started with oral medications, easier to swallow, easier to explain if interrupted, easier to disguise. It moved to liquid opioids. It eventually moved to fentanyl, the most controlled, most dangerous, most heavily audited substance on the floor. She also drank on shift. Investigators would later document that Olsen routinely consumed alcohol while caring for women in labor. She used marijuana on her days off and, by her own admission, on shift. She showed up to 12-hour assignments impaired, and she stayed impaired for the duration of the assignment. To pass the hospital's random drug screening program, she developed a method that almost no one wants to think about and no one ever forgets once they hear it. She obtained the urine of another person. Investigators never publicly disclosed whose, and she injected that urine into her own bladder using a catheter. When she was called for a random screen, she walked into the bathroom, produced the borrowed sample on demand, and passed. She had been doing this for an unknown length of time before March 25, 2022. The signs that should have caught her were there. Patients on her shift complained about uncontrolled pain. The complaints were logged but not connected. The patients were assumed to be undermedicated by their doctors, or to have a low pain tolerance, or to be drug-seeking. Postpartum women in a Midwestern hospital in 2022, many of them quiet, polite, raised not to make a fuss, would press the call button once, be told the chart showed they had just been medicated, and not press it again. They would lie there with their babies and try to breathe through it. The pharmacy data was there. The Pyxis transactions were there. The pattern of one nurse pulling controlled substances at rates higher than her peers was there, sitting in audit logs that no one was running often enough. The hospital's diversion monitoring program, if it was functioning at all that quarter, was not catching her. It would take a single shift, a single drug test, and a single colleague walking into the wrong patient's room to bring it down. We are heading into the shift where it all unraveled. If you have made it this far, you already understand why this channel covers what it covers. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We do not look away from these cases. Drop the city you are watching from in the comments. I read everyone. March 25th, 2022, a Friday. The Waterloo Hospital's labor and delivery unit was at moderate census. Most of the rooms occupied, but not full. Christina Olson clocked in for the 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. shift at the start of what the floor calls the early shift, the one that picks up the overnight handoff and runs through the morning rounds and into the early afternoon. She was assigned 3 patients, 3 new mothers, 3 babies. 2 of the mothers were in postpartum recovery. One had delivered by cesarean section 2 days earlier, identified in court documents only as Mother 1. She was a high-risk pregnancy patient. Her recovery was complicated. Her pain orders included scheduled hydromorphone and as-needed oxycodone, with low-dose intravenous fentanyl available for breakthrough pain. At some point during that shift, the hospital's nursing leadership made a decision. The reason has never been made entirely public. It may have been that a colleague had finally said something to a supervisor. It may have been that the pharmacy audit had finally flagged her transaction volume. It may have been that someone on the night shift the previous day had noticed a vial that should not have been where it was. What is known is that the hospital drug tested Christina Olson during her March 25th shift. The sample was sent for analysis. The results came back the same shift. She tested positive for opiates, oxycodone, hydromorphone, marijuana. The drugs she tested positive for were the drugs her patients had been prescribed. The drug screen alone was almost certainly going to end her career. But while she was still on the floor, before she had been confronted with the results, a separate event was unfolding 2 rooms down. A different L&D nurse, name withheld in court documents but identified internally, walked into a patient's room to perform a routine check. The patient was a postpartum mother, not one of Olson's 3 assignments. On the bedside cart, in plain view, were 3 items that should not have been there: an open fentanyl vial, an open ephedrine vial, an epidural bag. All 3 had been removed from the Pyxis cabinet under that patient's name. The patient had no orders for any of them. There was no clinical reason for any of them to be in the room. No nurse had documented administering them. They had been pulled out of the system, brought into the room, and left behind on the bedside cart like loose change. The nurse who found them did the thing nurses are trained to do, but rarely have the will to do. She did not put the vials back. She did not assume it was an honest mistake. She did not call the pulling nurse and ask about it quietly. She walked directly to her charge nurse, and from there to the unit manager, and from there to hospital security. She handed over the 3 items in her gloved hand. The fentanyl vial was bagged for analysis. That was the moment Olson's career ended. She did not yet know it. She finished her shift. She charted her patients. She handed off to the oncoming nurse at 3 o'clock that afternoon. She walked out to the parking lot in the late afternoon light, got into her car, and drove home down University Avenue. She had no idea the vial was already sealed in an evidence bag in the hospital's pharmacy office, waiting to be sent to an FDA laboratory for analysis. That analysis would be the document that ended her. The fentanyl vial went to the FDA Office of Criminal Investigations laboratory. The lab did 2 things. First, they examined the vial under magnification. The rubber stopper at the top of the vial showed 2 distinct puncture marks rather than the single puncture that normal use would leave. The rubber surface at the bottom of the vial, what investigators called the bottom stopper, showed puncture marks as well. A vial used normally on a hospital floor will show 1 puncture on top, where the nurse drew the dose. 2 on top suggested a draw followed by a refill. Marks on the bottom were stranger still. Someone had pushed a needle through both rubber surfaces of the same vial. Second, they tested the contents. The lab analysis came back, showing that nearly all of the fentanyl in the vial had been replaced with saline. The vial labeled as fentanyl was, by mass and by chemistry, salt water with trace amounts of the active drug. Not enough to do anything for a patient in pain. That was the smoking gun. From there, the investigation moved quickly. FDA OCI agents subpoenaed the hospital's Pyxis transaction logs for the previous 6 months. The logs showed a clear pattern. Christina Olson had been pulling controlled substances at rates that diverged sharply from her peers on the same floor working the same shifts. Her hydromorphone pulls were elevated. Her oxycodone pulls were elevated. Her fentanyl pulls were elevated. The patients she pulled for, when interviewed, often did not remember receiving the medication at all. Agents interviewed patients. The interviews were difficult. Many of the women had been discharged weeks or months earlier. They had been physically wrecked at the time, often on epidurals, often sleep-deprived, often on the second day of cesarean recovery, and barely tracking the names of the people coming in and out of their rooms. Their memories of specific medication events were fragmentary. What they did remember, almost universally, was pain that had not gone away when they were told it would. Mother 1 was interviewed. The court documents describe her as a high-risk pregnancy patient who had undergone cesarean section on March 23, 2022, and was assigned to Olson's care on the day Olson was caught. She remembered the pain. She remembered ringing the call button. She remembered being told her medications had been given and that she needed to give them time. Agents also interviewed Olson's colleagues. The picture that emerged was a nurse who had been showing the classic signs of impairment for months. Slow movements at the nursing station, sometimes slurred speech on phone calls with the on-call physician, long bathroom breaks, disappearances during the middle of a shift, pupils that were sometimes pinpoint and sometimes blown. The colleagues had noticed. The colleagues had not formally reported. The hospital's own internal review uncovered more. The drug test that morning had not been a random screen. It had been a 4-cause test, triggered by accumulated reports the hospital had not previously acted on. The fentanyl vial in the wrong room had not been a one-time accident. It had been part of a pattern stretching back at least into January and possibly into the previous fall. The total count of victims, when agents finished cataloging, was at least 50 new mothers. 50 women in active labor, in delivery, or in postpartum recovery, who had been documented as receiving Schedule II pain medication that they had not actually received. 50 women whose pain had been managed on paper and ignored in practice. The investigators acknowledged the true number was likely higher and could not be fully recovered from the records. The case was referred to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Iowa. The lead prosecutor was Assistant U.S. Attorney Timothy L. Duax. The charges were drafted across the fall of 2022 and into the winter. By then, Olson had already surrendered her nursing license to the Iowa Board of Nursing. That happened in July 2022, 4 months after the catalyst shift. She had not worked as a nurse since the afternoon she walked out of the hospital parking lot on March 25th. The federal case was filed in early 2023. The investigation had taken close to a year, and what it had built was overwhelming. The Pyxis logs, the patient interviews, the lab analysis of the fentanyl vial showing puncture marks on both stoppers and saline where the drug should have been. The for-cause drug screen showing oxycodone, hydromorphone, and marijuana all in her system at once. The colleague statements describing months of obvious impairment. The bladder injection scheme, disclosed during the investigation, that had allowed her to pass earlier random screens. By the time Olson sat down with her defense attorney to discuss her options, the case was already closed in everything but name. There was no exculpatory theory that could explain a fentanyl vial with 2 puncture marks containing saline. There was no innocent reading of 50 falsely documented administrations across 3 months. There was no defense to the bladder injection. There was no version of the facts that did not result in a felony conviction. She agreed to plead guilty. On October 12, 2023, Christina Eileen Olson appeared in federal court in Cedar Rapids before U.S. District Judge C.J. Williams. She was 42 years old. She wore a plain blouse and gray slacks. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun. She did not speak much during the proceeding. The plea was to 3 counts. Count 1, acquiring a controlled substance by misrepresentation, fraud, deception, and subterfuge. Count 2, adulteration and misbranding of a drug with intent to defraud and mislead. Count 3, false statements relating to healthcare matters. The combined statutory maximum was 12 years in federal prison. The exchange in the courtroom was brief. The judge asked her if she understood the charges. She said yes. He asked her if she had falsely documented administering pain medication to women in her care. She said yes. He asked her if she had drawn fentanyl from vials and replaced the contents with saline before returning the vials to the unit. She said yes. He asked her if she had stolen narcotics from at least 50 victims during her time on the labor and delivery floor. She said yes. The exchange ended without elaboration. She did not offer an explanation in open court. She did not weep. She did not address the women whose names were attached to the case file. She walked out of the federal building in downtown Cedar Rapids on the afternoon of October 12, 2023, a convicted felon out on bond, with sentencing scheduled for the following spring. Sentencing was held on March 27, 2024, in the same Cedar Rapids courtroom. The maximum statutory exposure on the 3 counts combined was 12 years in federal prison. The pre-sentence investigation report described Olson's history. 2 children, by then in their early teens. A second marriage that was still intact. A nursing career that had spanned 18 years before its end. No prior criminal record. A diagnosed opioid use disorder that had reportedly begun, according to her own statements, after an injury several years before the diversion began. She had entered an outpatient treatment program in the months between her plea and her sentencing, and had reportedly remained in compliance. The government's sentencing memorandum laid out the scope: 50 victims minimum, 3 months of documented diversion, almost certainly longer. A fentanyl vial returned to a hospital floor adulterated with saline, available to be administered to any patient on the unit. The bladder injection scheme, the marijuana on shift, the pattern that had only been stopped by a drug test that should have been run months earlier and a colleague who refused to walk past 3 vials on a bedside cart. The defense's sentencing memorandum laid out the mitigation, the addiction, the treatment, the surrender of her license, the acceptance of responsibility, the cooperation with investigators, the 2 children who would be without their mother if she was sentenced to anything substantial, the absence of any prior criminal record. The court heard from at least 1 victim, by written impact statement. The statement was read into the record. It described a cesarean recovery in which the pain never lifted. A new mother holding her baby in a hospital bed and unable to focus on the child because of the constant grinding agony of an abdomen that had been cut open and stitched closed 48 hours earlier. A call button that was answered with chart references and a polite shrug. A trust in the medical system that had not survived discharge and had not come back since. Judge C.J. Williams addressed Olson before pronouncing sentence. He acknowledged the addiction. He acknowledged the treatment. He acknowledged the surrender of the license. He also acknowledged what had been done. He noted the singular vulnerability of the women on the labor and delivery floor. He noted the deliberateness of the saline substitution, that it was not a single moment of weakness, but a sustained, technical, repeated act, requiring planning and tools and a willingness to walk an adulterated vial back into the unit, knowing it would be given to another woman. He noted the bladder injection as evidence that Olson had known what she was doing was wrong and had taken extraordinary steps to continue doing it. He then imposed sentence. 1 year and 1 day in federal prison. 3 years of supervised release. Forfeiture of her nursing license to the United States, in addition to the state surrender already on record. No fine, given her financial situation. Restitution to be determined. 1 year and 1 day. The statute allowed 12. The court imposed 1 year and 1 day. The extra day, in federal sentencing, is a technicality. It makes her eligible for good time credit, which can reduce the sentence by up to roughly 15%. Without the day, the credit does not apply. With it, she could be out in approximately 10.5 months. The sentence was the story. The mothers who had been victimized, 50 of them at minimum, almost certainly more, would learn the number from local news coverage in the days that followed. Some of them had not known they were victims until the case was filed. Some of them had spent months wondering why their pain control had been so much worse than they had been led to expect from a maternity unit. Some of them had quietly blamed themselves for being weak, for not handling labor or recovery the way the women in their family had handled it, for not being tough enough. They now knew otherwise. Olson reported to federal prison in the summer of 2024. She was designated to a low-security federal facility. Her release was scheduled for the spring of 2025. She would emerge with a felony record, no nursing license in any state, and the obligation to disclose her conviction on every job application for the rest of her working life. The structural lesson sits in the gap between 50 and 1, 50 mothers by her own admission, 1 year by the court's judgment. The American hospital system has known for 2 decades that drug diversion by nurses is a systemic risk. Automated dispensing cabinets exist because of that risk. Witnessed waste protocols exist because of that risk. Pharmacy audit programs exist because of that risk. They did not catch her for at least 3 months in a Waterloo, Iowa labor and delivery unit, and when they finally did, the federal criminal justice system valued the harm done to 50 new mothers at 366 days. The patients on that floor had no warning, no defense, and no second opinion. The system that was supposed to protect them came down to a single nurse, a single drug test, and a single colleague's willingness to walk a fentanyl vial down the hallway to her charge nurse instead of placing it back in the cabinet and going on with her shift. Without any one of those 3 things, the diversion would have continued. The vials would have kept coming back filled with saline. The mothers would have kept pressing call buttons. The chart would have kept saying everything was fine. This case was difficult to sit with. The one on your screen right now is even harder to shake.